Hello, good evening everyone. Good evening, I'm Joost Depuydt from the Plantin-Moretus Museum and I welcome you all at this Woodblock webinar. We are really amazed. There are more than 400 people who have registered to be with us tonight. At the moment, we have about 250 people already joining. So I think we can start in a couple of minutes. I can already start with thanking some people. I'll like to start with it because otherwise I might forget it at the end. So first of all, I like to thank the Flemish government for funding our project at the museum and making it possible to digitize and describe the collection of woodblocks. But I also want to thank all the people who have helped us along the way of the project. And I think about Sophie Dierks, who sorted out the collection even before the start of the project period. She sorted out the whole collection and measured all the blocks in the collection. And then there are some volunteers at the museum, Anne, Annick, Annemarie and Lauren, who have helped us checking printed editions for woodblock illustrations. I also like to thank my colleague Christophe Selleslag, who's giving us technical support for this webinar. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the first speaker of tonight, Jolien van den Bossche, and she was also a project team member at the project. She has already left the museum because she has found another job at the City Museum of St. Niklaas, but she will tell us about what she did for the project for the last year and a half. Let's see, we are still, there are still people coming in, but I think since we have a very tight schedule, I think it's best that we can immediately start with the first speaker. So Jolien, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joost, for the introduction. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Okay, I hope that's visible for everybody. I'm very happy to present the results of our digitization project to you all, and given the very diverse audience today, I presume that not everybody has had the opportunity to visit the Plantin-Moretus Museum in Antwerp, so I'll first give a short introduction of the museum and its woodblock collection. Then I'll go into the digitization process and some of the adaptations we had to make along the way. And finally, I'll show some results and interesting blocks from the collection. The Museum Plantin-Moretus, located in the center of Antwerp, is the historic house and printing office of the Plantin-Moretus dynasty, from the 16th century up until 1876, when the house was sold to the city of Antwerp as a museum. As one of the most important printing houses in the 16th and 17th century, the Officina Plantiniana was widely renowned for its beautiful print work that spread newfound scientific knowledge throughout the Low Countries and the rest of Europe. Woodblocks in particular played a key role in visual knowledge transfer, up until they were superseded by copper plates on the printing presses. The woodblock collection consists of 13,797 blocks that were made between the 16th and 18th century, which makes the collection very diverse. They cover a variety of subjects, as Joost will later explain in his presentation. They range from millimeter-sized initials to folio-sized blocks and everything in between. Some have barely been used, others are almost black of ink. Some have been preserved very well, while others have been greatly affected by woodworm or post-restoration treatments. All the blocks, however, were treated with a very effective but highly poisonous product in the 60s. They were drenched in xyllemon and still have its distinct chemical smell. Since little research has been done on the long-term health effects of poisonous insecticides, we want to prevent manipulation of the woodblocks as much as possible. Recognizing the enormous historical value of the collection, the Plantin-Moretus Museum started a digitization project in 2019 with project funding from the Flemish government. We aimed to accomplish at least 3 things with this project. First, we intended to limit the physical consultation of the poisonous blocks by providing as much visual information and metadata as possible. Second, we expanded the accessibility of the collection for scholars, artists, and the general public, promoting research and creative reuse of data. Third, we attempted to provide an example for online registration and digitization for similar collections in other museums by communicating openly about the work process and results. We have 2 main goals, digitization and online registration. For the digitization, we photographed our entire woodblock collection, all blocks front and back. We uploaded these images in our digital asset management system, as well as their modern prints. Our online registration was done in Atelier Museum or Axial Collections Online. Our primary goal was to give each woodblock a minimal or basic description. As Joost will elaborate on this registration process later, I will only focus on the photography. This is a small clip of our new user-friendly interface that contains all modern prints of the blocks that were made in the early 60s. We added different tags to the images to make them more searchable. One of the biggest challenges of this project was the incredible amount of blocks that had to be photographed within a limited time frame of only 1.5 years. Furthermore, all wood blocks had to be photographed in a consistent manner. That's why we decided upon a few quality standards, such as that the object had to be photographed with a neutral background. The object's specific characteristics had to be clearly visible and readable. Objects had to be photographed from the same perspective and always front and back. Images needed to have a resolution of at least 600 dpi. We used the color checker passport camera calibration to obtain neutral and consistent color. A QP neutral grayscale card with millimeter scale was added to every woodblock as a reference material for both white balance and measurements. It was raised to the same heights as the block. We set up an in-house studio and systemized our process. The woodblocks were shot with an overhead camera angle resting on a table with a height of 86 centimeters. The camera was set up perpendicular from above at a height of 29.75 centimeters to the top of the block. To ease manipulation and substitution of the blocks, the ReproStance arm was directed away from the photographer. Because of this placement, the camera is now in a downwards position from the photographer. Raking light from a height of 110 centimeters from the center of the lamp to the floor and a distance of 70 centimeters from the center of the woodblock was chosen as a light source to accentuate surface texture and to exaggerate shadows. We ensured a resolution of 600 dpi and added a QP neutral grayscale that was turned into the same direction as the camera, of course. Raking light caused some texture areas to appear completely dark. To fill these shaded areas with light and to reveal more characteristics, a reflective box was made with 4 reflective panels. This image demonstrates the effect of each added panel of the box. 3 white sides ensured gradual tapering of the light. The 4th reflective panel rests on top of the box to limit shadows of the object onto the neutral background. The panel that is closest to the photographer can be opened when the blocks are changed. Every camera reads color differently. There will be variations from one camera to another, but even in the same model. Different lenses also have an effect on the color. That's why color management was an important part of the workflow. We used the color checker passport for color correction. This slide shows one of the blocks before and after the correction, after which the block regains its brown color. All blocks should have the same thickness to match the height of the type on the printing presses. But in fact, there are often small variations in thickness, which meant that the blocks had to be organized by size and thickness in advance. Larger blocks, meaning blocks that are bigger than 15 by 15 centimeters or 5.9 inch by 5.9 inch, for example, were photographed in a larger reflective box with higher panels. And when necessary, a second light source was added to enhance specific characteristics. For these larger blocks, we often also opted to change the direction in which they were photographed, as is illustrated in these two examples. In the first block, the Annunciation, the cutter used a lot of horizontal lines to create the surrounding architecture. If it was photographed like the other blocks with light hitting it from the side, these horizontal lines would not have been this distinctive. In the second block, there is a relatively large difference in height between the recessed area and the printing surface, making it no problem to photograph it from the side. Our process was systemized, but also pragmatic. Most of the blocks are dark from years of use, but some are even close to black, giving way to another challenge: retaining contrast on different blocks with a neutral background under similar lighting conditions. Some blocks also have shinier surfaces than others because of the ink that was used or the way they were cleaned. Blocks that are smaller and therefore take up less space on the neutral background tend to be overexposed under the camera settings that are used for other blocks. This is also often the case for blocks that have a more reflective surface. In these cases, the aperture setting of the camera was altered. For example, most blocks could be photographed with an aperture of f11, but with smaller or more reflective blocks, an aperture of f13 or even f15 was chosen to stop down the lens. But without further ado, let's look at some interesting cases and results. There are often several copies made of the same blocks, especially within the botanical collection. When looking at the recessed areas of the blocks, the part that we do not see on the printed illustrations, we can definitely discern different ways of cutting. The copies are almost always cut in the same manner with sharp, fine lines. They are also much lighter because they were probably printed less than the other block. When looking at the print, one can see almost no difference between the two illustrations, and it's easy to overlook that two different blocks were cut. When comparing the blocks side by side, we can also very clearly see differences in carving techniques, especially in the recessed areas. The recessed areas of the first block, for example, are almost perfectly smooth, as if the block itself was intended as a finished piece of art. It contrasts greatly with the second block, in which we see that large pieces of wood were chunked out of the block, leaving the image with a sort of contour line. The third block, again, shows an entirely different technique, with small uniformed gouged lines. The fourth block shows horizontal uniformed carved lines on the right, but on the left they are vertical, which of course could have something to do with the handedness of the cutter and the way he turned the block to cut it. When examining the blocks, we often detect parts in the surface that seem to have been cut away. One explanation for this could be that there originally used to be extra elements to the blocks, like seeds and flour and nuts, but that they were later removed because the author decided upon it, or because they were discovered to be incorrect and replaced by newly made blocks specifically for plant details. We often also find unusually shaped blocks. When comparing them to the illustrations in the publications, we often find that these cutouts were used to print the text closer to the image. For this image in Lobelius' Kruidboek, a first cut in blue was made to add text next to the leaf. In Lobelius' Icones Stirpium of 1591, two more cuts were made to add text next to the flowers. They hadn't been there in the publication of 1581. We also have quite a few composite or assembled blocks in our collection. Blocks that, for example, have been put together with nails. This one is quite interesting, since two blocks are not butted against each other, but one end of the block was laid over and connected to the other block instead. This type of joint is much stronger, but I hope you can all see the difference in cutting technique as well. While the upper block is quite smooth, the recessed parts of the bottom block are much chunkier. When we screen the Plantinian publications, we see that in the first publication in which the illustration was used, Lobelius 1576 Plantarum seu Stirpium Histora, only the bottom half of the block was used. Moreover, at that point, the bottom half of the root still had a piece of stem. In Lobelius 1591 Plantarum tam exotaricum, the piece of stem was removed and the composite block was used. At that time, Lobelius probably had found more information about the plant and found it important to include the leaves as well. In John Gerard's The Herbal of 1633, we see the same assembled block, but next to it is a depiction of the same plant, but in a different variety. The illustration is much more natural and dynamic because Lobelius was already familiar with the structure of the plant. Another fun thing we found were blocks with gaps for type. A lot of those can be found in the Agrillonius diagrams. This is a very economic way of cutting, since one block can be used multiple times with different letters or numbers. The next slides show some further results to demonstrate the variety of the collection, and all blocks can be found using the following link to the digital asset management system of the city of Antwerp. The object number is always npm.hb. followed by 5 digits. I'll just go through it now. The entire workflow for this digitization and registration process will be put available online by the end of this year. It can be found on the website of CEST, which is the Cultural Heritage Standardization Toolbox from Flanders, which was originally a temporary project commissioned by the Flanders Heritage Agency to define standards of describing museum objects. Now it's an up-to-date website with software packages, manuals, and guidelines. And the entire workflow will be free to download for everyone who has similar collections. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'll now give the word to Joost. Thank you.
Jolien, thank you very much. Before we go to the next speaker, I want to point out that all questions that we have or might want to ask to the speakers can be written in the chat function. And if you want to, that other attendees can see your questions as well, then you have to mark that you send your question not only to all panelists, but to all panelists and attendees. We will select some of the questions, and after a session of 3 speakers, the speakers will be asked to give an answer to some of the questions. So our next speaker, Hendrik Hameeuw, is a specialist of advanced imaging at the Imaging Lab of the KU Leuven libraries, and he will talk about using the portable light dome system to make advanced images of woodblocks. Hendrik, the floor is yours. Hendrik, we don't hear you. Can you put on your audio, please?
Yes. Okay, so you can see the presentation right now?
Yes, that looks fine.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are around in the world. We would like to give you an insight in the portable light dome system, which we used for a test case on the Plantin-Moretus woodblocks. So first, we will give you a short insight in what kind of technology we are actually speaking about here. And then we will also show you a couple of results with the portable light dome as we used it at Plantin-Moretus. I will give the talk. I prepared the talk together with my colleague Bruno van der Meulen. I would also like to say that the use of this technology is what we have been doing over the years in collaboration with several other projects. Many thanks also to Lieve Watteo, Jan van der Stok, and Chris Vastenhout. When we talk about this technology, we call it actually multi-light reflectance imaging. So we use several light sources, all with a different angle towards the object which is being imaged. and the software or the principles, the algorithms which are being used for the calibration and the calculations to come up with the final result is called photometric stereo. For many people in the heritage sector, these are not the most common terms to use, but quite a lot of people already do know what reflectance transformation imaging is, and especially with the abbreviation RTI, they are more familiar to that. Well, it is the technology we used is related to this RTI. As you can see on the timeline, at a certain moment at the university in Leuven, where we are based, we started experimenting with this technology, which was already, the principles were already known much longer. And over the years, after we started using it for cuneiform studies, we also started implementing it for documentary heritage, and actually at a certain moment for pretty much any kind of heritage.
Hendrik, can I just interrupt you for a while? Yes. It seems that a lot of viewers see gray bars to the right of your presentation and on the bottom of your presentation. Can you see if
Is this better?
It's better. We still see smaller gray boxes, but it's already better. Okay.
That's good. I don't know what the reason for that is.
Thanks. Okay. Go on.
It will work out. Okay. So the output of all of this is we have relightable images. So we have data sets, and with those data sets, as a result, we can virtually relight the surface we have imaged. One of the other benefits, for example, is also once you have this kind of data, you're also able to use all kind of other visualizations. It is up to us as researchers to ask a specific question to the data. And if we ask wise questions to that data, it might actually come to really good visualizations of what we hope to get. One of the elements which is also in the data is actually three-dimensional information of the surface. So these are some of these devices we have been using. The one which is being assembled over there in the corner is the one we actually used at Plantin-Moretus a month and a half ago. One of the other benefits is also once you start having these kind of portable light dome devices, you can equip them with white light, but you can actually also equip them with other light sources, with other spectra. Other spectra will react in a different way with a surface than white light. And for example, with the Woodblock tests we did at Plantin-Moretus, we only used the white light dome for the acquisition. And we saw, for example, that when the combination of wood and metal is on one and the same woodblock, that the metal didn't really get registered very finely and was not reconstructed very correctly. And our estimation is actually if we would use here only ultraviolet light or blue light, that we might come up with even better results. So this is already a first outcome of this test. So what is actually happening? So you have these dome-shaped devices. We have many LEDs at the inside of that dome, which are being mounted. Here you can see it on this sketch. And one LED by one LED, one light source by light source is being lit. So each time it has another angle towards the object, and one photograph is being taken. And then depending on which portable light dome or which dome device you use, in our case, we had 260 light sources. So we end up with a data set of 260 light sources, all with a different lighting angle towards the object. And what does the software then? So the algorithms, this photometric stereo algorithm, which uses this kind of information, what does it try to do? Well, towards the Woodblocks, one of the most important elements it was trying to do is for each of the pixels in your image, it tries to establish what the original orientation, which is represented by that pixel on the original surface, what the orientation of that pixel actually should be. So you get true three-dimensional information of your surface you are imaging. This is actually what we see here in this blue kind of image. This is called a normal map. And here on this result, each of the colors, this blue-purple kind of color, this red kind of color, and the green kind of colors you see, they actually represent in what direction that pixel is oriented. So we have three-dimensional information. How does the recording and the processing procedure works out? So you have the recording moment that takes something like 4 to 5 minutes per surface we image. That makes that we end up with a data set of some 260 images. That is, of course, of huge importance to understand that we actually end up with an enormous data set, which is gigabytes of information. But we don't like to work, of course, with gigabytes of information, and a final file, when all of the processing, so when that algorithm to understand what the surface is really about is being used, it actually ends up in a, although we have an original data set of many gigabytes, it ends up in a file which is 200 to 300 megabytes, which is, you can see there is a lot of information in there, which is more acceptable and not too large. And then we end up in, we can upload that into a viewer where we can inspect the result in 2 dimensions, but actually with 3-dimensional information behind it. And if we really want, we can even generate 3D models out of that. So here you see a couple of results, how it is being recorded with some other items. Also some results already being viewed in a viewer. So you can see we use it for cuneiform tablets. You can use it on a Egyptian mummy portrait or in an illumination. But once you have that kind of data, you can start visualizing it in many different ways, many different manners. Crucial also to mention is that the system we used at Plantin-Moretus and the system we have at the KU Leuven in Belgium is not the only system available in the world. There are actually many groups. It can be research groups. It can even be commercial partners who have developed similar kind of devices and can come up, can produce output, which is also similar to what we are looking at right now. If you do not have these kind of devices, you can actually produce a similar data set manually. So if you have a camera and if you have a light source, and everybody can get his hands on a light source, you can start producing a data set as such for yourself. As long as you have 60, 70 different pictures of exactly one and the same viewpoint and with exactly the same distance that the light source is being directed to your surface, you can create such a data set, and with open source software, you can create your own interactive data sets, which can also be uploaded, for example, to one of the viewers that I will show you in a few slides. So then these are some of the, this is the imaging, one of the imaging of one of the objects, the woodblocks at Plantin-Moretus. As you get best results when you are in a dark room. Joost and Jolien took the opportunity to put me for 2 days in the dungeons of the museum. Thank you very much for that. But it ended up with good results. If you are in a dark environment, you will have the best results. So you can see here one of the imaging processes. Also, using this technology on this type of heritage, this is not the first time this has been done. There are quite some examples already to be found around the world. I'm mentioning 2 of them. One was a test we did ourselves on a woodblock, which has a drawing of Bruegel on it and is kept at the Metropolitan in New York, and made that recording 2 years ago with the multispectral dome we have. And the study on that result was made by Professor Lieve Matteo of the KU Leuven. And also a very interesting project is the one of the Bewick nutcracker. And it's interesting there for those who are truly interested in using this technology, because there they scanned a number of woodblocks with 3 different systems, with RTI, so similar to what we are seeing right here, but also with laser scanning and with structure for motion photogrammetry. So if this is a technology you're really interested for this specific type of material, there you can actually already start comparing also, not only with normal photography, but also with other interactive imaging systems. And then some results from the Plantin-Moretus museum itself. So this is basically what we always get. So when we make a recording of a surface, we automatically, once the processing has been done, can visualize that surface in several manners. First of all, in 2 ways in a color mode. We have those 2 ways in color mode. The one is called albedo responses, the other one is called ambient responses. We can also remove the color values, and so the texture actually, which is on top of your 3-dimensional information, which of course will make sure that the actual relief will be visually much more clear. We can also ask to the data, why don't you accentuate every 2 pixels, which the orientation of the pixels is much more different to each other. When they are both the same orientation, make them both white, but when they are not the same orientation, make them more and more and more and more black. And then you actually get a sort of automated drawings, sketch modes as we call it, and we can do that in 2 different ways. We call it sketch mode 1 and sketch mode 2. And then again, we have these normal maps where you actually see the 3-dimensional information in a 2-dimensional manner, but it is 3-dimensional information. So if you want, you can make a 3D model out of it. And that is what you should see right now. That once you have that kind of data, although it's not always necessary to create a 3D model out of every single capture you make with this kind of technology, from time to time, it can be interesting to do so. Here then a small comparison between a print of that woodblock, a photograph of that woodblock, one of the results from the portable light dome, and then also a reversed sketch mode of that PLD system, where of course you can see, if you then the reverse sketch mode, you start comparing with the print. The print of course has only given you information on the very top of your woodblock, where the sketch mode of course gives you also information of the wood cut itself deeper into the woodblock. One of the other cases we came up that we selected, actually it was Jolien and Joost who selected that, was also a comparison between similar or copies of one and the same motif. What you can see over here, and that also you could already see it in the representation of Jolien. You can see how the different blocks which represent the same, but actually if you go deeper into the woodblock, you can see that the cutting work has been performed differently. Well, with these kind of data sets, that can be visualized very interestingly. Here for one of these examples, you see first a few results with different lighting angles. So now what you see is all with one and the same data set. Once you are in that viewer, these are the different ways how you can visualize your results. So without color, each time again also with other lighting angles. So this is all done in a virtual environment within a viewer system with the sketch mode or these automated line drawings. So you can start approaching your object in a complete other way, and all of that is based at the end on a recording phase, which takes only 5 minutes. Then another comparison where we have the 3 woodblocks next to each other, and then if we go to the line drawing, you can start studying way more in detail and also documenting very well how the woodblocks have been cut. Some extra possibilities here. If you have time for that, you can also consult some of the results yourself. It's a temporarily link to some of the results. So that's that short link you have over there at the bottom. You also have the long link, but the short link goes to exactly the same. It goes to an online viewer where you can consult these results. But one of the extras you have once you have these kind of data sets is that you have three-dimensional information, and that also makes that you can make measurements in a three-dimensional manner of that surface. Here you see the same with another block, and so also with another link to another data set. And here again, you can see that we can make measurements on the surface. And if you zoom further in, even closer, you can make very detailed measurements on that surface, which on the original block you would strictly spoken never been able to do. And then some other 3D representations of that same woodblock. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you to Joost for organizing this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Hendrik, for this very interesting presentation. People who would have questions for Hendrik, please put them in the chat function, and we will select from the chat for the Q&A after the third presentation. I'll now like to introduce you to the third speaker, Michael Goodman. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Cardiff University, and he's also the director of the Victorian Illustrated Shakespeare Archive. And that's an open access resource that contains over 3,000 illustrations taken from Victorian editions of Shakespeare's plays. He will tell us more about the Victorian Illustrated Shakespeare Archive, and I'm looking forward to that. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joost, for organising this, and thank you so much to everyone for coming along and listening to these talks, which have been fascinating so far. As Joost was saying, I'm the director of the Victorian Illustrated Shakespeare Archive, which is an open access resource and a project I've been working on for the past few years. In the Victorian period, wood engraving combined with new print technologies allowed for a mass market in illustrated books. And nowhere was this more evident than in Shakespeare and illustrated Shakespeare editions, which throughout the whole period became more and more prevalent within the society and within the culture. So what I'm going to do today is just going to show you through this project, the Victorian Illustrated Shakespeare Archive, or VISA for short, show you what you can do with it, show you some of the ideas behind it, and if you've got any questions, please ask me. Okay, so this is the homepage. And one of the ideas behind this project was that illustrations, wood engraving, wood block materials has been historically critically neglected. Now we're seeing a significant change with that in the past decade or so, and I think that's due to digital technology allowing us to disseminate and work with these materials in ways that are really compelling, as we've already seen, and quite fascinating. So at the top here are the editions and the illustrators. So this is Charles Knight, he was a publisher in the Victorian period. Kenny Meadows, an illustrator. John Gilbert's an illustrator, and H.E. Sellis. It's all about looking, discovery, not being scared. Who knows what's in here? But I'll show you around anyway. So if you click on Kenny Meadows, it'll come down with a drop-down menu of comedies, histories, tragedies, or view the complete set. The really nice thing about Shakespeare is it's a closed corpus of material. So certain characters, certain plays, certain themes recur throughout. So I had a limited set of tags and keywords I could use with this. So as we'll see shortly, but so they're always going to get comedies, histories, and tragedies, basically. So comedies, let's go down to Mary Wise of Windsor. And this will bring up then some thumbnail images of the play, The Mary Wise of Windsor, taken from Kenny Meadows' edition. Now you can click in anywhere here, but let's click at the start. And this will bring up a carousel view then of the illustrations. You can scroll through like this until you find one that you find particularly compelling. So let's keep going. That's a good one. That's a good one. Let's stay on Falstaff. And if you scroll down, we can see it's Falstaff, and we have all the bibliographical data. So the illustrator is Kenny Meadows, the engraver is John Orange Smith, the original illustration size, the illustration number, and the source text. And then people can write a comment if they so choose. But if I click here, view full size, this will bring the image up in high resolution. Each image in the collection has been digitized by hand by me on a scanner to 300 dpi, which means the resolution is really good. And it allows us to see certain lines and the skill that the engraver must have had to put into these works. So we go back again, back into full screen. So that's just one way through the archive. If you click here for illustration only, this will come up with what I call the heart of the archive then, and this allows us to do different sort of research, ask certain different research questions if we so wish. So again, we've got the details here. We've got what the original illustration looked like before, where we can see it's quite foxed. It's quite dirty. Every illustration has been tidied up in Photoshop. But here is the category. So it's an act 2, it's a comedy because it's the Mary Wise of Windsor. It's an interior scene. Kenny Meadows is the illustrator. So John Falstaff is the character, Mary Wise of Windsor. But the archive has also been tagged. The illustration in the archive have also been tagged with those items that we might not necessarily associate with a Shakespeare play. So we've got chair, drink, sitting, or walking sticks. So if we click on walking sticks, this will bring up every illustration in the archive then with walking sticks, obviously. And this allows students or researchers or teachers to compare and contrast how walking sticks may or may not be used in an interesting way in the Victorian period. So this is Macbeth, for example. One of the witches has got a walking stick there. And again, you all know how the internet works. This applies across all categories and all subject areas in the archive. So if I'm just, say, interested in Macbeth as a play, and click on Macbeth as a play, and this will come up then with every single illustration of Macbeth in the archive. What's that one there? Macbeth's head. Oh dear, sorry. That's a bit bloody. Let's go back. So let's go home again so I can show you more of the features that we can play with. So over here in the start looking area, if you don't want to necessarily go through the carousel view, you can just go here and say if you're interested in a particular character, let's say Ariel, you can click on Ariel and we can see that there was 34 images of Ariel there. So that gives us a sense of idea of, our potential to think about ideas and how they might work together as a coherent essay or a research paper, because it'd be quite difficult, I should imagine, to do a paper with just 2 images, for example. Yes, so all the illustrations have numbers after them. So they divide up characters, female, male, the edition, the genre, the location, and the place. So Midsummer Night's Dream, there's 82 here, and that will come up like that then. One of the most surprising elements for me with the archive that's been often commented on, which was really nice to see, is the use of the word clouds. Now, the word clouds are just another way of getting into the archive that I've just displayed to you all. But on the right here, we have the big Shakespearean categories. So we have the plays here like Love's Labour's Lost, Macbeth, tragedy, etc. But over here, you can see at a glance how many items or certain iconographic features feature regularly. So we've got swords, of course, that's quite obvious, trees, crowns, curtains, flora and fauna, flying. So let's click on, what have we got? Say, let's click on books. And again, it's a nice feature where you might not necessarily be a Shakespearean or thinking about Shakespeare in that way, but you might think, I wonder if there's anything interesting in these categories that tell us something about the Victorian period or Victorian ideas. So click here, and it's Bianca and Lucento from The Taming of the Shrew. Every single illustration you can, again, look again, it's all about looking. You can leave a comment. Say I could write here, write something very banal. I like this illustration. There we go, and post a comment. Oh, I've got to enter my email address because I haven't signed in, but you get the idea anyway. I can also then share these illustrations directly to social media, because one of the underlying themes of this archive was about making illustration research open and user-friendly and inviting to the public or students. So let me just tweet that. And there we go, Bianca Lucento, that's by me. There you are, click here for full for there. You get the idea. Again, you all know what social media is like. But again, part of the theme was embedding these technologies and options that we've become so used to in the past decade into what is an academic resource, just to make people feel comfortable. So if we go home again, we can see these are the recent discussions that people have been having down the side here. So if you're interested in a particular illustration or something particularly grabs you and you'd like to discuss it with me or with other people, please feel free to leave a comment and ask a question. We've got here the Victorian Illustrated Shakespeare colouring book. This is what I made at the height of lockdown to try and get people who are homeschooling kids sort of interested in Shakespeare. So there you go, click there and it shall download. That'll download a PDF. But let's go back because that is going to be too long to download then. And the really exciting thing about this sort of work is images and additions that I hadn't been aware of before, constantly making themselves available to me, and more over. It allows me to just update the archive when I like and how I like, and it's been a thrill to work on, and I hope you keep looking at it, and I hope you stay tuned for more developments shortly before Christmas, because we'll have a couple of new additions up then. Thank you so much. It's been a great day outside, so it's been nice to do this. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for introducing us to the Victorian Illustrated Shakespeare Archive. We have now time for some questions, so I'll ask the three speakers to put their video back on so that we can see them. And once they're asked to answer a question, they can answer it and put their audio on, of course. I'll have selected some questions for the three speakers. I'll start with Jolien. There are some questions for Jolien that will be answered in my presentation, or more or less, so I'll leave these questions out because they might be answered during my presentation. But I have an interesting one for Jolien here from Karel van der Waarde. When they combined woodblocks with metal type for the mathematical illustrations, how did they manage to keep the metal type straight, stable, and exactly at the correct height on the press? Jolien, can you
Yes, sure. Well, we have a few blocks that still have the lead inside them. So often the lead was hammered in through the back and it's still quite firmly attached. But in other cases, the type was just as high as the type would be on the printing presses, and they would add little pieces of extra lead in the side that would wedge the numbers and the letters in the cavities. So that's how they stayed in place. But when photographing the blocks, there were often cases where the letters would fall out. So I was happy to have photographed them so I could put it all back in place.
Okay, one more question for Jolien. Question from Freida Spira. How was the issue of toxic chemicals dealt with when photographing the blocks? So how did you?
Yeah, I was well protected because I photographed in a studio that was just for me, and I was wearing coats, gloves, spectacles, and a special gas mask from 3M. So I was well protected while photographing everything.
Okay, a question for Hendrik. Could you please share the link you showed in your presentation in the chat? Because some people didn't get it. So, but you have already probably done it in the meantime. Okay, that's fine. Another question for you. There are some questions about 3D, and if it would be possible using your 3D data of the blocks to make a 3D replica of a block, or can you comment on that?
So two ways to answer this. First of all, the answer is kind of yes. Yeah, you can do that. But the output of the system we have right now, you need someone who is familiar with this kind of data to make further transformations towards something which is printable. Yeah. So that is not in the output we create right now. It's not printable ready. Yeah? So from that point of view, some steps still need to be made. Yeah? That is one thing. A second element is that actually for a woodblock, for the size of a woodblock, so it comes with different sizes, of course. The larger the size of your objects we are imaging, the less the general dimensions are correct. So this is a system, this multi-light reflectance is a system which has enormous accuracy on local situations, but the complete size of it, the complete dimension, it will be a little bit concave actually. So the result is not anymore 100% correct in these dimensions. And if it is about a woodblock, I guess the top always has to be flat. So then the whole idea is a bit gone if you make a 3D model out of it. So in the first place, it is a viewing system where you can locally will have extremely correct results, but the general dimensions there, I would not use this kind of technology. If it is about, I want to make a 3D print out of it, which is as accurate as possible, and then you have to go for laser scanning or structured light scanning, these kind of results, these kind of imaging methods.
Okay, I have, let's see. I have some question for Michael. Did you consider using existing controlled vocabulary such as icon class to tag your images?
My supervisor, Julia Thomas, on her project, database in mid-Victorian wood engraving, used iconoclast. The problem was my project was based using WordPress. So it's one of the ideas behind it was I wanted my students and I wanted to be able to say to people that if I can do this using very limited technology, then you can use this as well. Iconoclast, as I understand it, is you need more bespoke software and to plug it in, I think. But I certainly would consider using it again. But I've had experience of using it, but not for my Shakespeare archive. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that answers the question. Yeah, I have another question for you. What application did you use to create your archive?
Oh, it was WordPress. So as I've just explained, I used WordPress for the reasons I wanted it to be open, and I wanted to be able to say to students and other researchers that there's software out there now that is very user-friendly. It's very intuitive. You don't need necessarily to be a programmer to do digital humanities or to create something that's valuable and rewarding. That said, I'm quite, especially after these talks today, with the amount of incredible technology and software that's been going on, I'm very aware that I'm starting at it's very DIY. But yeah, I'm proud of that. Because I think it sets a good example, I think.
Okay, I see that Jolien is already answering a question in the chat, but I'll ask you to answer it for the whole audience as well. Why were not all 6 sides of the blocks photographed, Jolien?
Well, time was simply too short to photograph all sides of the blocks, because you can easily photograph the front and the back side because they have the same height, so you can leave the camera at the same point. But if you want to photograph all the sides, the height always changes with the block. So you would have to put the camera up and down, and that would have taken too long to change. So, but we added all the information that was on the sides of the blocks in an Excel form, and we want to add it to our Adlib database when we have some time to do that. That's now Joost's his job.
Well, I can also add to it that our advisory committee of the project, there were some experts already asking about photographing all 6 sides, and we have considered it, but as Jolien explained, we just didn't have time in 1.5 years to do that, because that would triple the amount of photographs that had to be made. So that was practically impossible to do during this project period, but we might photograph some of the sites on which there is extra information in the future in a follow-up project maybe. Let's see, because we still have a lot of time, so maybe there are some other questions that we can put to the speakers. I have to go to the last questions that were put in the chat. Yeah, I see the question. Fascinating to learn of the remediation of the blocks that made them toxic. Is there any published study of that episode to offer a lessons learned for sharing? Well, we are in contact with a company who's trying to do something about the toxic blocks, and they might come up with a solution that we can make them less toxic in the future, and so that they can be handled easier than they can be handled today. But we haven't decided yet. And as far as I know, there are no published studies specifically on these kind of objects yet, but it's in the pipeline. Let's see. Are there any? Well, I think most, I'll have a look in the other questions. I noted the question about icon class. I can maybe comment on that for our project as well. We have looked at icon class for our woodblock collection, but again, because we didn't have the time during this project period to add icon class codes, it's something we might be doing in the future, but if we want to do it, we want to do it for the whole collection, and that means that you have to add icon class codes to all these 14,000 blocks. So that would take quite some time to do, because if you don't do it for the whole collection, it's no use, because then you fool your you fool the people who are looking in your database if you only do it for a couple of blocks, because then they think they find everything there is, but if you don't do it for the whole collection, then it's no use. So we are considering it, but it might take some more time before we can start doing it. Let's see. Maybe another one for Jolien. Jolien, are there many replica blocks in the collection? I will probably come on that during my presentation as well, but I think you can comment on it as well. And if yes, how were they obtained? How did, or do you know how these copies were made?
Well, there are quite a few replicas in the collection. Most of them are in the botanical collection. So I think we have a couple of hundred blocks that have one or even two replicas made. As I put down in the chat, I would recommend reading Jessie Chen's work about it, because she has an interesting hypothesis about that. And I don't really have time, didn't have time to further investigate where the replicas came from, but in the other collections, of course, there are a lot of replicas for the initials, but they were probably used on different page or on the same page, so that's clear why they are there. But for the botanical ones, it's a more interesting story, and I think Jessie Chen really explains it well in her publication. There are a few replicas that were made obviously because the original block was damaged, and you can see that on the first block very well, so it's clear why they are there. But I think we have a couple of hundred in the botanicals, and in the initials I didn't even count, because that would be impossible.
Thank you, Jolien. There are still questions coming in, so let's see. There's one more for Michael. Michael, can you say more about the scope of materials included in the archive, and where were they held?
So again, in keeping with the idea that I wanted the archive to set an example, to be a sort of democratic, anyone can do this, keeping in with that ideology, I suppose. I managed to get, because these things were mass produced in the Victorian period, they're not rare. I managed to buy most of the editions online on sites like Books or eBay, and the most I spent on a set of volumes was £50, which in the big scheme of things, especially in book history, isn't very much. And that then allows me to keep hold of all the copyright as well. So I'm not beholden to any special collections or other institution. It's all mine.
Michael, I have another question for you. Do you know if any of the blocks from which these illustrations were printed are still preserved?
This is I would love to find this out, because it opens up a whole new area of research for me. I've read some articles that said a lot of them were exported to mainland Europe and America. If anyone has any information about these woodblocks, please email me, because I would be so interested to learn more and find out about this. Because I say these woodblocks were so obviously so many of them, and they were robust. And I've not been able to see any in real life. So, but I would love to. So if anyone listening knows, please send me some ideas.
Well, I think we can leave it the question and answers for this session for now, although we still have some time. Are there any of the speakers who want to comment on anything they have seen, come across in the chat, or would like to comment on anything?
I just think you're doing some amazing work at the museum, and both the panelists before me were absolutely fascinating on the process of digitizing these wood blocks, and I can't wait to have a play around later this evening, because it's incredible work. Well done.
Okay. Although we still have time left, I suggest that we now have a short break and we start again exactly at 5:30, because there are probably people who are only joining us for the second session. So we start again at 5:30. That means in 22 minutes from now. In the meantime, you will see some, well, a kind of commercial break. You will see some slides, and that might inspire you as well. Maybe if you're still looking for a present for the holiday season that's coming up, you can get inspired by what you will see. Or there's also a publication coming out soon, we hope soon next year, a publication in which you will also find an article by Jolien and also by Jessie Chen, who has been named before, about the blocks in our collection. So if you want to go for a drink or something, it's now the time, and we'll see each other again in 20 minutes. Thank you for now, and see you all soon.
Hello, everybody, and welcome for the second part of this webinar. I see there are still participants joining us, but we are going to stay on track with our next speaker, Joost Depuydt, who is curator of the typographical and technical collections at the Plantin-Moretus Museum in Antwerp. And his presentation will focus on the creation of metadata and the challenge to describe a diverse corpus of 14,000 woodblocks. Joost, the virtual floor is yours. Joost, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, ready. I'm going to talk about the challenge to describe a diverse corpus of 14,000 woodblocks. In the 1960s, our predecessors at the museum have not only treated the woodblocks against woodworm, but they have also sorted the blocks by subject and numbered them. Once this operation was finished, they have made a print of every single woodblock and brought these prints together in 5 large volumes. Part 1 comprises about 2,000 religious and emblematic illustrations. Part 2 comprises about 2,000 so-called profane or non-religious illustrations. Part 3, filling 2 volumes, shows about 4,000 botanical illustrations, and Part 4 comprises ornamental blocks such as printers' marks, ornaments, and initials. When we look at these categories in more detail, it turns out that the botanical illustrations are by far the largest category of book illustrations. The other book illustrations are equally divided between the religious, emblematic, historical, and other scientific illustrations. All 8%. But the botanical woodblocks are even outnumbered by the ornamental initials, 33%. Earlier this year, in March, we launched an image base with high resolution scans of all these woodcut prints. People can browse or search by keywords to get inspired to do something creative with this extraordinary collection. And they can share it on our website, Impressed by Plantin. Today, however, I'm going to talk about our descriptive collection database in which we enrich the visual material with metadata. In this short presentation, it's impossible to go into much detail, so I can only present a quick overview of the diversity of woodblocks with some striking examples. First, we try to figure out the minimal set of descriptive fields. Apart from some more administrative fields, which are only visible behind the scenes, this is what we came up with. The 2 fields I will focus on mostly during this presentation are the title field and the printed in field, which reflects the printing history of the block. I would like to point out that from the start we have chosen to register the metadata both in Dutch and English. So when you consult the online database in English, you not only see the field names in English, but also the content of the fields. Other fields such as creator, description, and literature are of course equally informative. And fields like object name, material, and technique are mostly the same for every block. Just like the dimensions, they give more insight into the materiality of the block. First, we screened Léon Voigt's bibliography, the Plantin Press, to come up with a list of 387 illustrated editions. So far, Nearly half of them have been systematically scrutinized to describe the woodblocks used to print the illustrations in these editions. But at the same time, we have also expanded our search and included illustrated editions from later periods, printed by members of the Moretus family, the successors of Plantin. It was Jesse Chen, an intern at the museum 3 years ago, who first started listing woodblock illustrations systematically for more than 50 botanical editions. By using artificial intelligence software developed at Oxford University, it turned out that for about 200 botanical illustrations, we have 2 or more almost identical blocks. So far, we haven't been able to come up with a satisfying explanation why these copies have been made. This definitely needs further research. Jesse listed the captions of the illustrations in the printed editions. On the left, you see a list of woodblock illustrations for one specific edition. On the right, you see a list of all the editions in which the same block was used. As you can see, the same illustration appears with different plant names in different editions. And that's why we decided that we needed modern plant names to serve as titles for these blocks. So for every single plant, we have to identify the right modern plant name, both in Dutch and English, together with the official Latin scientific name. Fortunately, there is a group of botanical enthusiasts in the Netherlands who has already systematically identified all plants for 2 editions of the Doens Kruidboek. We first described the 1,461 woodblocks of the 1644 edition, and then added 714 woodblocks of the 1554 edition, for which we also consulted the website Scientificae Iconographiae Compendium of the National Center for the History of Sciences. So far, by doing these 2 editions and some more blocks, 57% of all botanical woodblocks have received a title with a modern plant name. Here you see a typical description of a plant, where Jessie has limited herself to 1 name. We try to list all names in all different languages from the original editions. So that's why we also have some volunteers going over all these editions again to note the full captions of the illustrations in these editions. Describing ornamental initials is a totally different story. We were inspired by the work of Stephen Harvard, and for 818 initials in his catalog, we still have the woodblock in the collection. Another great source is the Torad database developed by our colleague Christophe Selleslag. About 440 initials in his database overlap with Harvard's catalog, while about 80 new ones could be added. The reason why Torad lists less woodblocks is because the database only lists initials which were found in printed editions, while Harvard lists full alphabets, even if only a couple of letters from the alphabet have actually been used in printed editions. Let's have a look at probably the largest book ever printed by the Plantin Press, the choir book Octomissai by Georges de la Haye. In this opening, we can find 7 woodcuts. In the entire edition, we can find 1,726 woodcuts on 270 openings. So this is one opening, a verso of one page, of one folio, and a recto of the following one. That's an opening. But only 111 different blocks have been used to print these woodcuts, since the same woodcuts reappear frequently. Apart from the 86 ornamental initials, we have also found 17 different cartouches and 8 manicules, symbols of a hand with a pointing index finger. 98 of these 111 blocks have survived. In the description of one of these ornamental initials, you can see that we added a series title for the alphabet. We also described the iconographic scene, here the birth of Jesus, and in the printing history you see that we listed all the openings where this initial can be found in the octomissai. So far, all ornamental initials used by Christopher Plantin have been properly described with a series title for the alphabet. All the other initials used by his successors are only described with a minimal title. There's still a lot of work to do to group them in alphabets and give them a series title. On the other hand, we realize that it's nearly impossible to list all appearances of a specific letter in all the existing printed editions for 9 generations of printers. Nevertheless, we hope that the digitization of many books from our collection by Google Books, in combination with the help of artificial intelligence, might help us to list as many appearances as possible. From the largest book in our ever printed at the Plantin Press, we now turn to one of the smallest books. This litany was printed for the soldiers in the army of the King of Spain. All 56 pages are printed within a woodcut frame. Every frame is printed from 4 woodblocks. And since 8 sets are used twice, it means that no less than 192 different woodblocks were used in this tiny little booklet. While the decorative elements of the frame determine which 4 blocks belong together, it's not easy to use them as a descriptor for the frame. So we decided to focus on the iconographic elements to describe the set of 4 woodblocks, as you can see in this example. So in this frame you have the 4 evangelists depicted. Many of the religious woodblocks were already given a short title before our project started. That's why we decided to focus first on the other subject categories. Nevertheless, we have already screened the new Holstein volume on the book illustrations of Peter van der Borgt. Since the later generations of the Moretus family have mainly printed religious editions, there's still a lot of work to do to work out the printing history of these religious blocks. While Plantin printed about 70 liturgical editions, such as missals and breviaries, the 8 generations of the Moretus family have printed another 500 liturgical editions until 1866. I just wanted to show one woodblock from another edition. It's not a liturgical edition. It's a peculiar publication by Giacomo Bosio. And although it depicts a plant, it's not described the same way as the botanical woodblocks, since it comes from a religious context. And the special thing about the Latin edition, printed by Plantin in 1617, is that all the original woodblocks of the Italian edition, which were sent from Rome to Antwerp and remained there afterwards. Another subject category are the emblematic illustrations. This woodblock was used in numerous editions and translations of Claude Paradin's Les Devises Héroïques. For the emblematic woodblocks, we decided to use the title phrase of the emblem as the title of the woodblock, with a translation of the meaning of the emblem between brackets. For this specific woodblock, we are still wondering why it has a square hole in the center. We would expect that it was used to add text in movable type or another smaller woodblock, but none of the editions have anything printed in the middle. As an example of historical woodblocks, I present you this set of 2 blocks to print the portrait of Habsburg Emperor Charles V. It's one of 144 portraits of emperors beginning in Roman times. The tone block to print the colored backgrounds and the key block to print the portrait in black are printed over each other to get a chiaroscuro woodcut as a result. This series of 288 blocks has left the Plantin press at the beginning of the 18th century, probably together with a stock of the printed edition for which they were made, which was sold to the Verdussen family of printers. In the 1870s, the woodblocks ended up in the Archaeological Museum Hut Steen in Antwerp and were transferred back to the Officina Plantiniana in 1877, when it just had become a museum. I will end my overview of the collection with the woodblocks for Franciscus Aguilonius's Optica. This edition is mostly known for the engraved title page and 6 scenes designed by Rubens. But next to these engravings, there are no less than 576 woodcut illustrations of scientific diagrams printed from 495 different woodblocks. From the archives of the Plantin press, we know the 3 woodcutters who made these woodcuts: Jan, Gillis, and Willem Claessens. Since it's not easy to give all these diagrams a sufficiently distinctive title, we decided to add the paragraph title from the edition in the description. To conclude, this is the current situation of woodblocks with a title in our collection database. Overall, 75% of the woodblocks have already got a title. So it's still a work in progress, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joost. That was very interesting. For those who have just joined the webinar, you can add your questions in the chat, but make them visible for everyone, so the panelists and the attendees, and we will answer them in a Q&A after all the speakers have had their chance to present. Our next speaker is Lisa Voigt. She is professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the Ohio State University and a specialist in colonial and Latin American culture and literature. She is also currently the recipient of the ACLS Collaborative Fellowship, together with Elio Brancaforte and Stephanie Leitch, for the book project, The Epistemology of the Copy in Early Modern Travel Narratives. Her presentation centers on the illustrations of exotic animals, in particular crocodiles, in different travel accounts of Pierre Bellon and Leo Africanus. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right. Please interrupt me if you can't see anything, because now I can't see any of you anymore. This is very much a work in progress, and I look forward to questions and comments and suggestions. You could say that, let me get to, trying to advance my slides, sorry. Apologies, I'm working with two screens and it might not work for me. Maybe I need to close that. Okay. Let me try again. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So you could say that this reader's response to the limitations of a woodblock, that is the hand-drawn completion of this tale on a crocodile in Plantin's 1555 edition of French naturalist Pierre Bellon's Les Observations de plusieurs singularités, copied from an earlier Paris edition, served as one of the inspirations for the collaborative book project that I will present a very small piece of today. And this impression of a woodblock in the Plantin collection, an enigmatic crocodile that may be a copy of Bellon's, which has a complete tale but seems unfinished in other ways. Note it doesn't have any upper teeth, can serve as a sort of coda, no pun intended, to this presentation, and perhaps help to open up questions in the discussion about where woodblocks belong in the study of early modern illustrated texts, especially in this case, because we don't know where this woodcut belongs. It hasn't been identified in any printed text. The first image was one that I discovered in situ with the third collaborator on a book project that Stephanie Leitch and I are working on, with the support of an ACLS collaborative fellowship about copied illustrations in early modern travel accounts. That collaborator, Elio Brancaforte, and I first visited the Museum Plantin-Moretus in November 2015. That year, we were both in Europe on fellowships for different projects, but we agreed to meet at the MPM for a brief reconnaissance mission to see if we could further develop an article that we wrote and published together in 2014 about the illustrations in various editions of the German traveler to Brazil, Hans Stauden's account, and among them, we had worked a bit on Plantin's edition. We looked at as many editions of travel accounts, natural histories as we could in about 4 days, as well as the 5 volumes of impressions of the woodblocks that Joost just talked about, with an eye out for similar ethnographic images to the ones we had been studying in our research on Hans Stauden. I remember some of the copied illustrations of foreign peoples that caught our attention in that visit, but it was this hand-drawn crocodile tale that really etched itself into my visual memory. And when we returned to the Museum Plantin-Moretus in October 2019, now with Stephanie Leitch, who you'll hear from next on the current project, we revisited this crocodile's tale, as well as other editions of Bellon and other travel accounts over a longer 2-week period. We were also fortunate to meet and consult with Joost Depuydt on that visit, which got us our first glimpse of some of the woodblocks in the Plantin collection and planted the seed for our involvement in this webinar today. So flash forward to mid-March 2020, when we were supposed to continue our in situ collaborative research at the British and Bodleian Libraries on a trip that we had to cancel for obvious reasons because of the pandemic. However, our shift to virtual meetings over Zoom allowed us to continue to discover and pore over new archival materials together, and occasionally to invite other scholars to do so with us, including Joost. It was through these virtual collaborations that Joost shared with us this mystery crocodile. This one, right? We haven't, as I mentioned before, yet identified it in any printed source. I share this brief itinerary from on-site to virtual research and collaboration because even when we don't have any choice but to do the latter, and believe me, there's nothing I want more than to be able to go back to Antwerp and the museum in person, I think it's a good example of how digitization projects like the one you're hearing about today offer invaluable opportunities for continued research and wider collaboration, even when travel to collections is impossible for whatever reason. So let me spend the rest of this brief presentation sharing with you some of the questions that these and other crocodile tales, T-A-I-L-S, have raised for me, which I'll briefly relate to the questions about crocodile tales, T-A-L-E-S, in travel accounts that this research has raised for me. So I'll start by saying that this edition of the crocodile tale is intriguing to me as an example of how readers responded to the images of exotic places, peoples, flora, and in this case fauna, that they increasingly encountered in print in the 16th century, even when they couldn't travel themselves. This is the question at the heart of our project on copied illustrations. When printers chose to recycle an old woodblock to illustrate a new text, or when they chose to bear the expense of having a new woodblock carved to illustrate a text, what do these choices tell us about book buyers and readers' demands and expectations? And ultimately, how are they receiving and processing new information about the wider world? Would anything exotic do as in this camel illustration that was included in a book about travel in Brazil? Or did publishers think that readers would expect a closer connection between illustrations and the text and place depicted? As the historian John Eliot pointed out in an essay revisiting his earlier and rather famous argument about the blunted or uncertain impact of the Americas on European consciousness, that was in a set of lectures published under the title The Old World and the New in 1970, that he revisited later. Publishing decisions do in fact provide an important window onto this impact, quote, since publishers, if they are to survive, need to know and gauge their markets, end quote. In a sense, we're looking at the decisions made by those involved in the publication of text and images in our project as a sort of proxy for the direct reader response to foreign information that we find in that hand-drawn crocodile's tale. The reader's completion of the tale is not particularly surprising because crocodiles were not entirely unfamiliar to Europeans in the 16th century, even though here it represents an exotic beast encountered on Bellon's travels in the Near East, one that was called, in another edition of Bellon, the most marvelous of the dangerous monsters produced by the Nile River. As Bellon himself writes in the description he added along with the crocodile illustration in the second edition of Les Observations, we see them, I'm just going to say the English, we see them as though by miracle in many churches and squares of our Europe. And in Edward Topsell's History of Four-Footed Beasts, an English translation and copy of Conrad Gessner's zoological work, the Historia Animalium, that is more or less contemporary to these accounts, Bellon is cited in the margin alongside a similar claim about the familiarity of crocodiles to European viewers. Quote, the picture of the crocodile was wont to be stamped upon coin and the skin hanged up in many famous cities of the world for the admiration of the people. And there is one at this day in Paris, in France. Hang on to that idea of admiration. Crocodiles, that is, were familiar, though still remarkable, sight in some early modern European cities. And that familiarity could have inspired the reader to complete the curtailed illustration by hand. Although some of the crocodiles on view could have suffered the same fate as one described in a catalog of the Royal Society Museum, where it was identified as having part of the tail broken off. The truncation of the tail let's see, here we go. In Plantin's edition is in fact quite a bit more pronounced than the original illustration in the Paris edition of Bellon. The woodcutter of the Plantin edition, Arnold Nicolai, appears not to have accounted for the size of the woodblock or the printed page, just as he did not account for the inversion of orientation that results from copying directly onto a woodblock, although, of course, this is not unusual for copied illustrations. This woodblock is unfortunately not in the museum's collection today because it was among those sold at the auction of Plantin's press in 1562. Thus, when the Dutch naturalist Charles de Lecluse urged Plantin to publish his Latin translation of Bellon's work along with the images in 1589, Plantin had to have the illustrations from the 1555 edition copied onto new woodblocks, and thus their orientation was inverted once again. And then those woodblocks from the 1589 edition were reused in Clusius's Exoticorium Libri Decum, published in Leiden in 1605. And thank you to Joost for putting all of that together for me. Despite the 1589 version's reduction in size to better align with the text of the page, and note how in the 1554 and 1555 editions, the illustration had exceeded the text margins, the copy retained the crocodile's truncated tail. In this respect, all three versions differ from an earlier woodcut of a crocodile with which they otherwise bear some resemblance. Here's an earlier version. This woodcut appeared in one of the earliest printed and illustrated zoological texts, Michael Herr's Grünlicher Unterricht, 1546, and was copied, again with the orientation reversed, in a German translation of Pliny's Naturalis Historia published in Frankfurt in 1565. So these woodcutters managed to include the complete straight tail by reducing the size of the crocodile's body with respect to the woodblock. The comparison with other prints of animals suggests that long tails posed a unique challenge to woodcutters and engravers, and some look to other solutions than the long straight tail depicted in the Her and Pliny volumes. And I do more comparisons with other animals with long tails in the larger chapter. Let me just show you some more crocodiles and other solutions. So two German and Flemish broadsheets, probably printed around 1565, depicted the crocodile with its tail underwater, and Hendrik Hameeuw followed their example in the illustration of a scene of crocodiles and large birds that was added to the second edition of his 1668 travel account to, as Benjamin Schmidt puts it, lend an appropriately exotic flair to the narrative. By depicting the crocodile climbing on shore with the tail still submerged, there was no need to depict the complete appendage. Other solutions allowed woodcutters to fit the tail within the limited dimensions of a woodblock. In the naturalist Guillaume Rondelet's L'Histoire entière des Poissons, the crocodile's tail is not only shortened substantially relative to the body, but also curves slightly upward. Gesner solves the problem through both a curvy tail and by rotating the image 90 degrees with respect to the printed text, so that the crocodile could appear in its full, powerful dimensions. Oops. Two German broadsheets of 1564 resemble the aforementioned ones in all but the tail. Instead, that is those previous broadsheets I showed, instead of submerging it in water, they represented in curlicue form an exaggeration of the more natural curves that Gesner and others depicted. And another extant German broadsheet printed in 1565, perhaps a copy of one of these since it reverses the orientation, has the entire front half of the crocodile cut out, leaving only the curlicue tail and hind legs and the full caption below. Perhaps this part was excised in order to be traced onto a woodblock. And once again, a portion of the crocodile is all that would fit. The truncated broadsheet is conceptually the mirror image of the one in Bellon's Les Observations that I opened this talk with, awaiting completion, or in this case, restoration of the full crocodile. Okay, so where do all these tales leave us or lead us? The manuscript edition of the tale in Plantin's Bellon led me to look carefully, as we've seen, at the choices that other artists and woodcutters made to represent crocodiles within the limited dimensions of the woodblocks. Plantin's woodblocks, and that is in both the 1555 and 1589 versions, after all, seemed to be something of an outlier in not including the tail, the full tail, which at least one reader felt they needed to address. And I more recently come across a manuscript copy in Adrian Kunin's Fist book, produced in 1577 to 1580, which we might also consider in this light, seeing as how he had to extend the tail beyond the box. The textual descriptions accompanying illustrations of crocodiles suggest why it may have been important to include, or at least allude to, their tails. As Topsell put it in The History of Four-Footed Beasts, the tail of a crocodile is his strongest part, and they never kill any beast or man, but first of all, they strike him down and astonish him with their tails. And for this cause, the Egyptians, by a crocodile's tail, do signify death and darkness, end quote. Another one of the travel accounts published around the same time as Plantin's, the Historiale Description de l'Afrique by Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Bassan, known as Leo Africanus. Plantin's edition is from 1556, tells a tale, T-A-L-E, of a crocodile tail that does more than signify death, it actually leads to a death, but that also serves to authorize the traveler's eyewitness experience of the animal. Leo Africanus describes how late at night on a journey up the Nile River, he was the only one awake aside from an old man. When the old man tries to grasp what he thinks is a piece of wood floating on the water, Leo Africanus reports, quote, he was suddenly entangled with a crocodile's long tail, end quote. Leo Africanus continues by describing how he shouted to awaken the other passengers on board, but it was too late to save the man. The violent encounter helps to authorize his first-person experience with those dangerous monsters produced by the Nile. In the preface to the reader in the English translation of his work, John Pori refers to Leo Africanus' escape from the, quote, devouring jaws of the crocodile, end quote, as one of the marvelous firsthand eyewitness experiences that authorize his account. John Pori and Leo Africanus invoke crocodiles, in particular dangerous encounters with crocodile tails and jaws, to appeal simultaneously to the enchantment of the marvelous and the disenchantment of empirical observation in a period that is often described as one in which we start to see a shift from the former, the enchantment of the marvelous, to the latter, the disenchantment of empirical observation, in depictions of the natural world. And I'm evoking the way that Peter Mason talks about this supposed shift, one that he challenges in his book, Before Disenchantment, Images of Exotic Animals and Plants in the Early Modern World. As a scholar of early modern texts in the Iberian world, particularly colonial Latin America, I have long been focused on the tensions and overlaps between the rhetoric of the marvelous and the claims of eyewitness experience in travel accounts. Crocodile tales, T-A-I-L-S, and tales, T-A-L-E-S, share in this dual appeal. Marvelous creatures were not deemed incompatible with claims of authenticity and eyewitness experience. The illustrations of animals made to accompany travel accounts, and of course the woodblocks made to produce those illustrations, have more recently been showing me just how much that dual appeal was part of the function of illustrations as well. And perhaps until we discover where and whether the mystery crocodile woodblock was ever used, we can speculate about whether it was deemed to be insufficient in one or the other regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Lisa. Last but definitely not least is Stephanie Leitch. She is Associate Professor of Art History at Florida State University and has an upcoming volume, The Art of Observation in the Early Modern Print. She's also working on the book project, The Epistemology of the Copy in Early Modern Travel Narratives with Lisa Voigt, and her talk will examine how copies of woodblocks made their way into the media for which they were not originally intended, and how their frequent reuse has implications for various knowledge-based disciplines. You go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jolien. Oops. Let me then also reiterate my thanks to you, both Jolien and to Joost, for the very warm welcome you gave us at the Plantin-Moretus this time last fall. We're still waxing nostalgic You can tell. And then for any of you who have not yet visited the collection, as a researcher there, you have absolutely unparalleled access not only to the objects, to the woodblocks, to the printed books, but also to the scholars and researchers there. So it's amazing. We could not have done what we have been able to do without your assistance. Let me also thank you all for attending, especially digital software developers and digital imaging specialists, because you are now really leading our research. And I speak not just for us, but perhaps for many of us. So, oh no, I'm having Lisa's problem. Here we go. This talk will examine how copies of woodblocks made their way into media for which they were not originally intended. Instead of notions of original authorship that established the gold standard of Renaissance art making for centuries, the visual tradition also owes a great debt to copied illustrations, as Albrecht Dürer's woodcut of the rhinoceros from 1515 makes clear. Not only horned quadrupeds, but also conventional images of feather-skirted cannibals, indigenous peoples of Africa and India, and recognizable character heads from physiognomy comprise the repertoire of early modern recycled images. This talk will track the itinerary of several of these images that became pre-packaged tropes through their frequent reuse, and it will reflect on the significance of this for the study of prints. So among the pejorative monikers that appear in the secondary literature for images pulled from blocks after their initial printings is the idea of the false impression. For instance, this broadsheet printed in Antwerp by Jan van Doesburg in 1520 of the Vespucci Mundus Novus letter has been labeled a garbled report, quote unquote, because it sutured the Atlantic itinerary of Amerigo Vespucci to that of a merchant headed elsewhere. Its images are mostly drawn from the report of the merchant Balthasar Springer, who originated in the Tyrol and sailed to India with patrician families in Augsburg, namely Welser and Fugger. And the image reproduced Hans Borkmeyer's designs for an earlier publication of Springer's trip around the coast of Africa to India. So you've heard now that I'm collaborating with Lisa Voigt and Elio Brancaforte on a project called the Epistemology of the Copy in Early Modern Travel Narratives, generously sponsored by the ACLS, that seeks to rehabilitate the role of reused images and examine such copies for their generative potential. Our project participates in a larger attempt to rehabilitate pre-circulated images, one that aligns itself with Stephanie Porris's work on viral images and networks, and Taylor Clement's work on images afterlives. And in this presentation, I echo the term that Clement explores in her article called Movable Types, but only very loosely to imply copies of pre-circulated images. This talk will address images that became familiar through recirculation. And in fact, I think we can say that their formats developed by their publishers primed them for export. So the Antwerp broadsheet, which you see in a detail on the right, it linked two sets of pre-circulated images. Most of these derived from the Tyrolean merchants' report of exploits in Africa and India, of a venture that established the Portuguese viceroyalty in Goa. The images that line the edges of the broadsheet are copies of designs made by the printer Hans Borkmeyer for a woodcut frieze, first printed in Augsburg in 1508. Now, some of the blocks featuring Borkmeyer's designs are among the over 1,500 wood blocks preserved in the Dachau collection of the Kupferstich cabinet in part of the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. And so what I'm showing you here on the left is the block itself, and I'm sure you all can see probably much better than I, that it's broken in various places and sort of sutured together here. The impressions, various impressions drawn from it appear on the right, and the top one is the reconstruction of the frieze we currently believe to have been current in Borkmeyer's time, and the bottom one is an image which is also sort of divided in the middle that resulted from a pulling of the blocks in a different arrangement. I hope you can see that. So as we can see in this puzzle-like mounting of a segment of his frieze, The movability of even Berkmeyer's original blocks gave rise to various arrangements in restrikes on view and an impression preserved in the British Museum. Indeed, the generative potential of Berkmeyer's designs of the inhabitants of Africa and India can be seen through several cycles of repetition that they underwent, including his own reuse of them for a woodcut triumphal procession later commissioned by the Emperor Maximilian. Berkmeyer's images had already been recycled in Antwerp by Jans van Doesburg in the decade before the 1520 broadsheet. He first used them in an edition of Springer's Die Reise van Lissabon, the transcript of his journey from Lisbon to India. For this publication, van Doesburg transformed Berkmeyer's representation of coastal communities in Africa and India into woodblocks that compressed them into nuclear family units interleaved throughout the text. And I'm showing you a selection of pages here. So all but the very introductory square of this broadsheet, which I've marked out here, Vespucci, and come from that source, are drawn from, all but the very introductory image are drawn from Springer's report. This image of the feather-skirted cannibals used for the Vespucci portion of it came from another publication. So van Doesburg's original source was a broadsheet associated with Vespucci's Mundus Novus, printed in Augsburg, circa 1505. The group of Brazilians from the Augsburg broadsheet was a representation that traded in broad stereotypes that essentially cemented the image of the Amerindian to the feather skirt. What incited van Doesburg to connect images from Vespucci's itinerary to Springer's was likely the fact that he had already published both accounts as quarto-sized pamphlets between 1507 and 1508. So the images in van Doesburg's original pamphlet of Vespucci's Van der Nieuwerwelt did not follow the stereotypical representation of indigenous Brazilians delivered by the Augsburg broadsheet. But by the 1520s, the feather-skirted group of Brazilians from Augsburg had become so iconic that van Doesburg opted for this image instead, and possibly even designing the square-shaped broad woodblock specifically for this broadsheet. Indeed, the feather-clad Brazilians followed the current visual practice of distinguishing among indigenous communities by dress and weaponry better than the naked Amerindians who originally accompanied van Doesburg's 1507 Vespucci pamphlet. So in this move, van Doesburg packaged and he solidified the idea of representing extra-Europeans as data sets. He presented them in tightly bordered squares and in homogenizing kinship units whose members were dressed in quote-unquote characteristic costume. By recirculating these images, van Doesburg may even have attempted to revive interest in his earlier travel publications, or he may simply have capitalized on a way to recycle woodblocks that were gathering dust in his workshop. But because van Doesburg had already packaged these data sets for export in their original publications, it was fairly easy for him to recycle them. The recycled images of peoples of Africa and India that appear in Venice almost exactly a century after the Antwerp broadsheet reveal how durable van Doesburg's repackaging was. Giovanni Bottero's Aggiunta, printed in 1618, seems expressly designed to showcase images that the printer Alessandro Vecchi likely scavenged from elsewhere. In this quarto-sized pamphlet printed to accompany the Jesuit historian's Relazioni Universali, we find copies of Berkmeyer's images that have been pulled from a woodblock, likely originally designed for another purpose. And let me just show you here. I'm sorry, I can't show you the entire thumbnails of the book, but I show you a portion here. If you can see my cursor, this is where the Berkmeyer images begin roughly, and this is where they end. And the images here derived from Berkmeyer's frieze form roughly 50% of the images included in this. So the original block likely replicated the frieze format of Borkmeyer's. After inheriting the block, the Venetian printer subsequently surgically carved that rectangular block into smaller sections to facilitate printing its content onto quarto-sized pages. Now, at the moment, I'm not currently aware of which prior publication Becky might have exploited here, and I would be grateful for any leads about that. As the MA student from Florida State University, Chase van Tilburg, has shown in his very skillful recreation, from which we can infer the appearance of this block. It was one whose division into sections was premeditated. The chosen segments were reformulated into discrete kinship units, identified by distinct costumes and geographic toponyms. Becky has also broken down the procession of the King of Cochin, which was another very recognizable segment of Borkmeyer's frieze. Across several pages where sections of it prompt Botero's textual explanation. Botero's publication is also notable for using this kind of data staging as an opportunity to revive images of the monstrous races, which had largely fallen out of use by this time. The scholar Sandra Young has shown how such resuturing of groups of humanity to the tradition of monsters has both complicated the project of ethnography assigned to Borkmeyer and contributed to a discourse of racist perceptions of the global South. Of course, the recombinations of such data sets were responsible for developing new ideas about geography, about cartography, about travel illustration, about travel literature in general, and certainly suspicions about the globe's humanity. So these examples show well how woodblocks were understood and perhaps even conceived as movable units with afterlives in mind. To what degree this can be established is hard to say, but printers such as Sigismund Feierabend and Theodor de Brie would capitalize on recirculating familiar images and sometimes inventing new genres as they did so. Another genre whose creation was entrenched in practices of woodblock recycling was physiognomy. The compilers of 16th century remnants of the secrets literature, such as complexion books and physiognomies, did try to pin certain character traits onto specific profiles. For example, onto the shapes of particular foreheads, chins, or noses. But try as they might, such taxonomic projects of the authors were routinely thwarted by printers of copies who inverted images or who used them decoratively, as we can see here in the final pages of a complexion book printed in Strasbourg in the 1540s. The visually compelling images of profiles began to float free of character prescriptions that the text itself tried to pin down. But they did not float free of the idea of character assassination. As Taylor Clement has shown in her Renaissance Studies essay, Movable Types, the de-individuated portrait in the age of mechanical reproduction. Through their prodigious afterlives, the generic heads invented by printers of continental physiognomies and metoscopies, which were handbooks for delivering diagnoses about lines on the forehead, came to stand in for criminals in this broadsheet ballad that chronicles the events of the Babington plot to overthrow the English monarchy. In the ballad broadsheet, these heads from physiognomies now stand in for portraits of the perpetrators. So in conclusion, the process of reinscribing portrait-like particularity into generic character heads, or the process of reseeding monsters into extra-European regions, reveals two current and important aspects of the study of prints that a path through the investigation of woodblocks can afford. The first is that the tracking of copies of woodblocks can offer some concrete data for the analysis of reception. The sovereignty of the so-called beholder share, apart from the original intent of the artist, is clear in these afterlives. The reader will associate the generic character head in the broadsheet ballad with individual identities and might even bring the baggage of forehead diagnoses along with it. The second pathway privileges the printer's agency in selecting blocks to accompany these particular texts. These choices reveal a culture of print that was steeped in recycling, reuse, and indeed sustainability. So when we now see a printed image, we might also try to imagine for what other purpose it might have been used. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was very interesting. So we'll go ahead with the Q&A now. I think it would be useful if all speakers, yes, put on their videos. Joost. Yes. Okay. A lot of questions for Joost. So maybe we'll start with one for you. Somebody asks, I'm playing around with the website while listening. Is it possible to identify all woodblocks for emblems in the database? Any tips?
Well, so far, the emblematic scenes which have been described all start with emblematic scene in English or emblematische voorstelling in Dutch. So that can be the trigger to find all these emblematic scenes. But I have to admit, some of these scenes were already described before the project and are still lacking the English title. So we can't promise that you will find all the emblematic scenes yet, but we're still working on it.
Thank you. Lisa, somebody asks, just where in Paris is the specimen on display that you spoke of as carrying on this custom of exotic creatures in public spaces?
Yeah, that's just a reference in Topsail's History of Four-Footed Beasts, and I can share that that page reference if you'd like. But I loved seeing all the tips about where crocodiles can be found in different churches in Europe. I was familiar with some of them. Certainly, the Seville one is very famous. I just, that's the real advantage of this kind of presentation with so many people on, is exactly that sort of sharing. So I am gathering all of these links, and I really appreciate that. And I shared an article in case the person who asked that question or anyone else are interested in tracking some of those down, an article that lists about 36 of those churches, but certainly indicates how familiar they were to seeing crocodiles, even though they didn't lose that connection to the exotic by virtue of being displayed in churches where they were associated with ideas of evil and sin, as the article that I posted explains. I see some more links in here that I'm going to take a look at quickly.
Stephanie, Evelyn Lincoln asks, can you give the name again of the person who wrote the book on mechanical types portraits? Thank you so much.
Sure, Evie. The scholar is Taylor Clement, and it's an article that she wrote in Renaissance Studies, I believe, in 2016. I'll put it in the chat. Movable Types, the de-individuated portrait in the age of mechanical reproduction. Happy to share that.
One for Joost. Have you noticed any correspondence between the initial and the historiation around it? Could the K you showed, for example, stand for Christ, or in Dutch Christus? I have noticed such correspondences in some English historiated initials, with A, for example, showing some scenes of Adam's life, M showing Moses, etc.
Yeah, we have noticed that there are correspondences, and so far we have not explicitly mentioned that in the description, but people can work it out themselves. But for later periods, for all these liturgical editions, we found out that we have an awful lot of initials depicting saints, and they usually use the initial of the first letter of the name of the saint and use that saint for that initial. Actually, just today, a new intern started, and she will work specifically on all these initials depicting saints. So yes, we have noticed the correspondence, and we will work on it in the future as well.
Stephanie, I think you're getting a lot of suggestions for some copies, so maybe it would be interesting for you to read the chat, but I will copy them also, so you will have them afterwards. But this one is
everybody for your suggestions.
this one's probably a question for everybody. We've been talking about the blocks a lot. So the question is, do you think that the blocks themselves have ever been considered as works of art? Maybe an exclusively modernist concern, they ask.
I believe that maybe we can start to think about the way in which they were valued. I'm not sure I want to go with already works of art in the early modern period. I think definitely the German expressionists did begin to think of blocks as works of art, and even seek out some of the early modern blocks for that reason. But the Derschau-Sammlung begins with a collection of blocks that wound up in the collection of Willibald Pirkheimer, who had taken it from some of the local printing shops in Nuremberg. And so those were likely not collected for the purposes of restriking or to be reused, but I think there was some aesthetic value that was connected to them already in that period. Mid-16th century, shall we say.
I cannot comment if they were considered as works of art, but we do know that the woodcutter was paid much more than the designer of the block. Today I came across the prices for one initial, and it costed 6 stuivers for the designer for that design of that one wood block, but the woodcutter was paid 3 times more, 24 stuivers. So that might indicate that the cutting was highly valued.
I think with this you're also answering another question, which is were the names engraved of the cutters or the designers on the woodblocks as well, or did you undertake additional research? But I think it's probably archival information.
Well, there's still a lot of archival research to be done, but we also checked existing literature on specific woodcutters, like the woodcuts designed by Peter van der Borgt I mentioned earlier on. And we do know, for instance, for the Aguilonius blocks, that's archival research, that we know exactly the names of the woodcutters. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. Some woodcutters would cut their initials on the print side of the block so that it was printed with the illustration. We know that some other blocks have indications on the sides of on the back of the block that might indicate the woodcutter. But as I said, there's still a lot of work to do. We are just opening up this, this collection, and we presenting it to the rest of the world and to do research on this collection.
The one I mentioned of the crocodile at the beginning of my talk is made by Arnold Nicolai, and he does use his initials to identify his cuts. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention about this idea of the quality of the woodblocks, what I hadn't ever noticed before, seeing the difference in the techniques and how smooth some of them are, how carefully they're made, is quite interesting, and actually interesting for me to think about our mystery crocodile that we haven't identified, because it's fairly carefully. I know we've looked at it and talked about it quite a bit as being somewhat cruder than other versions and unfinished, but it is actually quite it's quite smooth, I would say, in comparison to some other. It's not just hacked away, and so that's just another sort of data point that we can glean from this work that might be interested in thinking about. That helps me think about that woodblock that we don't have as a woodcut in a text.
Joost, one more for you. Someone wants to know what software we use for our registration, but for us it's a little bit more complicated because we also reference to books and publications. So maybe you can elaborate a little about that.
Yeah, for the metadata about the blocks, we use Adlib as the database system. But as Jolien mentioned, we also link to our library database. So for all the links to the titles of the editions in which the blocks were printed, and also to the references to literature we use to describe the blocks, we link to our ANET database. That's a consortium database of all Antwerp libraries. It's mainly it's the system that was made by the University of Antwerp, but it's also used by all the museums in Antwerp. And well, actually, we have the Adlib database, the descriptive database, the library database, but we also have the image database, and we try to link all these databases to each other. So you can go from our database to the image database as well, and vice versa.
Okay, I think the rest are more suggestions to look into than questions. So maybe we're quite ahead of schedule now. Yes, we should definitely. Ad Steinman is also contributing to the printing things, and he is elaborating about the identities of woodcutters. So that's a very interesting article for everyone who wants to know something about that. And well, I think the rest are more suggestions, so maybe we can conclude it here if there are no urgent questions now.
At the beginning of this session, I saw a question about our copperplate collection. And I can just mention that we have plans to do the same kind of project with the copperplate collection than we did with the woodcut collection. But to make digital images of copper plates, it's even more difficult than to make digital images of woodblocks because of the reflectance of the surface. So that will be quite a challenge, but that's also in the pipeline for the near future. If there are no more questions to be answered now, we will save the chat, and we might distribute the questions to all the speakers, so they're free to answer them later on as well. I can only thank all the presenters today who have done a wonderful job, I think. But I also have to thank the audience, because we never expected to have that many people interested in woodblocks. At first, before Corona times, we were planning to have a physical seminar in Antwerp, and we would probably have attracted a couple of dozen of people, maybe. And now we have, well, there were more than 400 people who had registered. It turns out that we are between 200 and 300 people in the audience over the whole webinar. So it's, to us, it's an enormous surprise that we could attract that many people, and we thank you all for your contributions and for the chat. So thank you all. Have a nice evening for the Europeans, or a nice day for the people from America, and see you all later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.